Hey everyone. So we are going to be talking all things evolution today. So you've probably heard the saying survival of the fittest. That's kind of what we are talking about. Evolution is all about how we came to be as we are on this planet and how all other organisms on this planet also came to be as they are right now. And then we're also looking at the relationships between different species and different populations to determine the relationship. So, like the familial relationship, how are different species related? So, some of the questions that we're going to be asking for this unit are going to be: how did life on Earth start? What is the evidence that supports the theory of evolution? How does natural selection work? That's sort of the driving factor of evolution. And then, why are organisms the way that they are? Why do certain organisms have certain traits and other organisms don't have those traits? And where do those traits come from? So before we really get into evolution, we do sort of have to talk about how it was discovered and the guy that came up with this theory in the first place. So before we get into that, evolution in terms of biology, it does have a very different meaning than just in the regular vernacular, regular way of speaking. So for biology, evolution is referring to changes in characteristics within a population from generation to generation. And it can lead to the creation of new species. So we use the word evolve or evolution just to sort of mean change or adaptation. And so, in terms of biology, we are still talking about a change, we are still talking about an adaptation. However, it is not happening in an individual, it is happening within a population. So, many individuals of the same species that come together. We're looking at a population and we're looking at how this population changes between generations. So from parent to offspring to grand offspring, etc. So these changes, these adaptations, they are not happening to the individual, they are happening to the population between generations. And so that is a very important distinction to make in terms of using this word within this class. So when I'm talking about evolution, I'm talking specifically about changes in characteristics. So this is changes in your genes, in your traits, in your DNA, in your phenotype within a population, so within a group of individuals of the same species, and from generation to generation, between generations, between parents and offspring. Now, the guy who came up with this theory, his name was Charles Darwin. So that is definitely a name that you need to know and be aware of for the MCAS. But this guy, Charles Darwin, he went on a sea voyage in the year 1832. And basically, he went to a collection of islands. He went to many different places, but the main place that's talked about is a group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. So, right here. And on these islands, he went around, he was called a naturalist. So he went around and studied the natural species, the natural life forms that appeared in these different locations and in these different islands. And basically, what he found is there was all these different organisms and all these different life forms that were very similar to animals and species and life forms that he recognized from his home. I think he's from like England or somewhere. But basically, don't quote me on that, by the way. But basically, on these islands, he discovered different species or new species that were similar to what he's used to seeing. But he also noticed that these species between islands were slightly different as well. And so his most famous species that he studied were the finches, which is a type of bird. So these pictures right here are showing you all the different types of finches that are found on the different Galapagos Islands. And just looking at these finches, we can all see that they are similar birds. They all look kind of similar, but there are differences between them as well. So we can look at, and what's mostly talked about is beak shape and size. So like, for example, down here, we look at these two finches. They both have like small, sharp, pointy beaks. And then we can look at other finches such as this one right here and this one right here. And they have a wider, probably shorter beak. And so Darwin noticed these differences. He also noticed similarities. And so he asked questions like, why are they different than what I'm used to? Why are they different island to island? And then why are they also similar at the same time? So to help us better explain evolution and also sort of like how life came to be on this planet, I have this video of Bill Nye, and he's going to explain this to you in emojis. He does talk a little bit quick, but the images of the emojis he uses, they do make sense. So pay attention to the imagery as well. So if we go back to Darwin, Darwin did notice a couple other things, but besides these similarities and differences. So he had this idea that living things will change over time. And so again, we are talking about this on the population level and between generations. We're not talking about just individuals that we're looking at in that moment. So he came up with this idea of descent with modification. And so let's just look at like what this phrase means. Descent is talking about parents having offspring. So you descend from your parents. And then modification means changes. So we're looking at changes within organisms, again, that are different from parent to offspring. So the definition is newer forms of life are modified from older forms of life or older organisms. So you can replace the word modified with evolved as well. And so now that we've made this noticing, we've made this observation, we then as scientists have to ask the question why and then how. So first we're going to talk about the why. Why do these changes happen? Why is there descent with modification? So we've observed this phenomenon, but we haven't talked about the reason why it happens. So let's think about this for a second. Every single organism has the potential to have offspring. I like to think about this in terms of like a zombie apocalypse. So every single organism has the potential to have offspring, right? And so we know, looking like at ourselves versus our parents versus the rest of our family and even friends, acquaintances, strangers on the street, offspring will not be exactly identical. So you are not identical to either one of your parents or both of your parents at the same time. You are different. You have a different genetic code than your parents. Now, because we are not all the same, we are different within our species. Not all of the offspring are going to survive. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of the zombie apocalypse. Let's say that most of us do not contain a gene that gives us immunity to zombie bites. Let's say that maybe 2 of us in this entire class contain a gene that makes us immune to zombie bites. So, like I said, 2 out of maybe 20 people now have immunity to zombie bites based off of their genetics. So we're in a zombie apocalypse. The zombies are coming. They're biting all up on us. Most of us will not survive because we don't have that particular trait. However, the people that do have the immunity to zombie bite trait, they will survive, and then they are more likely to have traits that are beneficial for their survival in the environment. So our new environment has zombies. They have this trait that's beneficial because it makes them immune to zombie bites. They're more likely to survive, have offspring, and pass that trait on to their offspring. So that's this idea of descent with modification. Like I said, it's at the population level, not at the individual level. You can also look at this in terms of this phylogenetic tree that you're seeing here. So there's a little point down here and then it branches off. I know the thing here is covering it. But we have a point down here, and then it branches off into these different types of organisms. And so this is showing sort of the evolutionary relationship between us as humans to other primates. So the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the gibbon. And so what it's saying is we all have this common ancestor that's similar to all of us. It's still different from all of us, but it's similar enough to all of us that this is our common ancestor, and this ancestor gave rise to the gibbon. And then a little bit later over here, it branched off and gave rise to the orangutan, or it went in this different direction over here. So eventually, again, it branched off and gave rise to the chimpanzee. And then the chimpanzee and the gorilla share a more recent common ancestor. And then the human over here has a more recent common ancestor with the chimp and the gorilla compared to the orangutan and the gibbon. So that's what this model, this phylogenetic tree, is telling us over here. Again, it's just another version of descent with modification. So now we're looking at how we get evolution. How do we get descent with modification? So now that we kind of understand the why, we need to sort of give it some labels and talk about it more. So we have this idea of modification by natural selection, which is very similar to descent with modification. Basically, the idea here, it's survival of the fittest. If an organism's traits enable it to survive better and reproduce, it will pass these traits on to its offspring. So again, if we look at the zombie bite scenario, natural selection says that those with the immunity to zombie bites are more likely to survive, which means they're more likely to reproduce, and they're more likely to pass that trait on to their offspring. So then if we look at our zombie apocalypse 100 years later, that means that most of the humans, which they might not even be human anymore, but most of the humans are going to have this immunity to zombie bites because those are the people that originally survived, had children, passed that trait on to their children. The classic example is to talk about the giraffe neck and why the giraffe neck is so long. So there was variation in the length of the giraffe neck. Same way in humans, some people have a longer neck, some people have a shorter neck. But the idea was the giraffes with the slightly longer necks had an advantage in terms of getting food. So giraffes like to eat the leaves on the trees up here, and they're nice and tall, so they have to be able to reach higher. Now, the giraffes with the longer necks, because you can't just grow a longer neck, the giraffes with the longer necks were better able to get food because they're better able to reach the leaves that they eat, which means that they were more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring. The ones with the shorter necks, they didn't survive. They starved to death, so they never reproduced, and then they didn't pass the short neck gene on to their offspring. So over many, many generations, that's how the giraffe neck grew to be so long. So again, it's not happening to an individual giraffe, it's happening to the population giraffe as a whole. Now, when we are talking about individuals within a population, we might refer to their fitness level. This is not talking about like how much weight you can lift or how far you can run, how fast you can run. For biology, fitness is talking about how many viable offspring you produce. So technically speaking, if I like have my friend right here next to me, I'm going to call my friend, let's go with Nicole. Okay. So I have my friend Nicole here right next to me. And let's say that she has 2 offspring. She has 2 babies and they are both able to reproduce. And then I have no babies. I have no offspring. She would be more fit than I am. Because she has offspring that can then go and reproduce. So that's what fitness is talking about, how many offspring you have and how many of those offspring can then go reproduce. Now, let's make a slightly different scenario. Nicole still has her 2 babies and they're both able to reproduce. Now I have 3 babies, but only one of them is able to reproduce. Even though I have more babies than Nicole does, she is still more fit than I am because more of her babies can reproduce than my babies. And basically, when we are looking at these changes, natural variation of offspring from parents and mutations will cause some of these changes that we see in natural selection. So when we say natural variation, we're talking about the length of the giraffe neck. In humans, we see natural variation in hair color, hair texture, eye color, height, wet or dry earwax, free or attached earlobes. All different alleles are natural variation. Some of these alleles in some situations might be more beneficial to that environment, and that's what causes natural selection. So we can see natural selection sort of in two different time frames. So it's asking how fast does evolution happen? It takes many, many, many generations to see true evolution. However, you can see it over the course of a few generations as well. So there's this idea of gradualism. Same idea as when things happen gradually, they happen slowly and steady over time. Gradualism is when there is slow and steady change over millions of years. That's what you're seeing in this picture right here. We have this moth, and as you can see, we have a version of this moth over here that looks very similar to our first version, and we have a second version that gradually gets darker than the original. The other form is punctuated equilibrium. So equilibrium is keeping everything the same. Equal means same. Punctuated means things stay the same for a while, and then there's a rapid change, and then they stay the same for a while again. So it says no change, then rapid change, then no change, etc. So what you're seeing here in terms of butterflies or moths, we have our original moth over here, and then all of a sudden we get a very black moth and a very white moth, and then we see them stay the same for a while longer. So those are two ways that we can watch evolution happen. So at this point, please check in with your vocab notebook. Make sure you are following along. When we come back, we are going to be talking about the different pieces of evidence that we have to support the theory of evolution.